quick overview of the major NINDS clinical trials networks that are currently in existence. So you get an idea as to what their trial development process is, and also a little bit of a sense as to what sort of inputs you would need in terms of how, in terms of the outcome of the clinical trials, the early phase clinical trials that you're designing, in order to be potentially competitive and have the scientific information you need to really be at the stage to go through these. And each of the networks has a little bit of a different threshold for how far you are in the development pathway. And Chris is going to cover NeuroNEXT. Rob Silbergleit and Valerie Durkalski are going to cover NETT, and Valerie Durkalski is going to cover StrokeNET. So, unless she has designated a delegate. She's got it. All right, very good. So we'll let Chris go first. And the idea is for questions and answers to be in each of these sessions.
All right, so NeuroNEXT, which stands for the Network for Excellence in Neuroscience Clinical Trials, is a network that it has some advantages and it has some challenges, right? So one of the advantages that it has is that it's applicable to everyone, I think for the most part, in this room. So unlike a lot of other networks or consortia, NeuroNEXT was set up with the following objectives. So to test promising new therapies, increase the efficiency of clinical trials, and respond quickly as new opportunities arise. But the key thing of that is it covers basically the entire neurosciences for the most part. Right? So it's very broad in terms of what diseases would be covered in the network, and that it kind of covers anything that's under NINDS purview with very few exceptions. And to look at like just how diverse the disease areas that we cover in the network, we have 4 ongoing studies right now in spinal muscular atrophy, multiple sclerosis, myasthenia gravis, and acute stroke. Right? Those all have very different challenges, both with the disease and with the conduct of the trials. Stroke came in. Now that StrokeNET is formed, Stroke is not through NeuroNEXT. So we're doing that study because it was in really before StrokeNET was formed. But outside of stroke, almost anything else of the disease that's covered in the NINDS purview is eligible for NeuroNEXT. The only thing that's not, and I'm not sure exactly the history of this or why, Wendy or Robin may know, but exercise-based interventions are not allowed in NeuroNEXT. I don't know why. I don't know, Wendy. Or
I don't know.
All right, so the structure of NeuroNEXT is it's set up so it's a UO1, which I assume are you familiar with what a UO1 is? Right. So you're familiar with what an R01 is, right? There's a lot of discussions of R01. Really, a UO1 is kind of an R01 on steroids, where NIH, instead of like kind of, you're on your own, you report to your NIH program officer, a UO1 is like an R01, but the program officer or NINDS is a co-investigator essentially and helps to manage the project. So it's more of a collaboration with NINDS as opposed to, it's your project where you're getting money from it. That's the thing. Is that a good description? So NINDS is involved in the network infrastructure. Elizabeth McNeil is our program officer, who's the interim director of the clinical trials group at NINDS, and Janice Cordell. There's a clinical coordinating center at Mass General, and there's a data coordinating center at Iowa. So I'm the PI at the data coordinating center. Merritt, I cannot say her last name for the life of me. Sikovich is the PI at Mass General. I've slaughtered that with her. So the other aspect of that, so there are 25 clinical sites that were funded in the network that were kind of chosen, based on their quality of the application, but also to give geographic diversity across the country. And so this was chosen to provide this network. So you've got this network infrastructure that is particularly appealing to someone like in your situation where you're a junior investigator. Do you have a trial? If you're at an institution where you don't really have access, or it's hard to put together the access to have the infrastructure to do the trial, you can come into the network and kind of tap into the network where you don't have to pull it all together. You just have to have a strong enough proposal to come into the network to work with the network to do that. There are a couple of things by having this network structure that were put together to help increase the efficiency of clinical trials. So one there's been a lot of talk about central IRBs throughout the week and the course. NeuroNEXT uses a central IRB at Mass General, and one of the requirements when the network was put together that all 25 clinical sites, their IRBs had to see to the central IRB, so that every study that comes in goes to one central IRB that covers all that, except for if there's local language that has to be in the informed consent. And so but that increases the efficiency in that aspect, and that you don't have to go to 25 different IRBs, which is, if you've ever been involved with that, you get 25 very different types of reviews, because there's a lot of heterogeneity across the different types of reviews. The other aspect, which comes into play, the contracting of sites when you're starting a clinical trial can take a long time, because there you've got lawyers from one institution talking to lawyers from another institution, and lawyers like to talk. And so that can take a long time to kind of get together. When NeuroNEXT was set up, the other thing that was done early in the life of the network is the 25 sites all signed master clinical trial agreements with Mass General. So it was one contract that covered every trial that's initiated within the network. So as new trials come in, we don't have to negotiate contracts with the site. They're already in place. It takes another step out of the efficiency. The other aspect that NeuroNEXT provides is, doing multi-site clinical trials is expensive, right? And it's complex, both in terms of time, money, lots of different aspects. Designing a clinical trial is also complex, right, as you can imagine. And kind of the tricky part, in terms of, you look at it, when Kurt was here yesterday and talked about the simulation and all the adaptive type things, you see way more complicated simulations and adaptive designs in industry trials than you see in academic trials. And there's a good reason for that. In industry trials, there's a lot of resources devoted to building teams to do that type of modeling and really spend a lot of time in the design. In academic trials, right, you have to design your trial to finalize your rough protocol, to write your grant, to submit your grant, to get it rejected the first time, to resubmit your grant, and hopefully get it funded on the second submission, right? So there's a long period. You don't have money to pay for the design, right? You don't get the grant money until the very end. So there's not as much of an infrastructure in academics to do all of this type of design work. That's one of the things where the networks like you'll hear about today, like NeuroNEXT, helps, right? So there's infrastructure which also provides some basic level of assistance in terms of experienced clinicians, experienced biostatisticians who can work to clarify the design. So in terms of, from your level, in terms of submitting proposals to NeuroNEXT, the first step is to complete what's a concept form, which you can go to, I think I had it on an earlier slide, www.neuronext.org. So all the key policies, forms that you would need are on that website. You would submit a concept form to NINDS. They have to first accept it, right? Is this within something that NINDS feels is within their priority list they want to pursue? If it gets accepted, that initial, then it goes for 2 levels of review. First, it comes to NeuroNEXT for a feasibility review through the NeuroNEXT Executive Committee, and that's just really based on, are there sufficient patients at the sites? Are there competing studies which would make it difficult to do within the network? Is there sufficient enthusiasm to meaning the sites would like to participate in the study? So it's really feasible. It's not a scientific review. It's just more, if this study were funded, could it be done within the network given the current structure? The other aspect that goes to an NINDS extramural science committee if the budget is over the $500 a year, which is kind of your standard that you have to do with any trial. If it passes both of those, it goes to kind of a protocol design phase where each protocol is then paired with a clinical coordinating center lead and a data coordinating center lead. And so you have maybe one design call because everything is clear, or maybe it could turn into multiple design calls. There's a lot of variability in terms of that. But the goal of this is to get a finalized synopsis, really similar to what you guys have gone through in the course, that lays out the key things. What's your objective? What's your basic schedule of assessments? What's your sample size? So that you can draft a rough budget. Then the way the network is set up, there's no funding centralized to do trials within the network. So each individual investigator then has to write a grant application for that trial that has to get funded. If it's funded, it comes into the network for implementation. So a couple of things from that that we've seen. So the network provides help kind of in terms of basic level of design, but doesn't really help each investigator coming in with an idea to totally flesh out a protocol. So one of the things as a junior investigator that I would encourage you to do, which is important anyway, whether you're coming into NeuroNEXT or not, as you're doing clinical trials, is to try to pair up with a senior mentor, somebody who's got clinical trials experience who can kind of help you think of some of these questions ahead of time. A lot of the type of things that have come up in the course are things that we see all the time in these early design calls, right? Somebody comes in, on the first call you're like, okay, how are you going to get your drug? Well, the company's going to donate it. Okay, do you have a letter from them? No, I saw somebody at a conference, I asked them, they said it'd probably be okay, right? It's the type of things of just with maybe the logistical operational issues. When all that happens, then you come in, you have the infrastructure of NeuroNEXT behind you, which means you've got an experienced DCC, an experienced CCC, all this existing infrastructure to really help you through that. And we've had a mix of the 4 studies. 2 of them are really junior investigators who really have limited clinical trial experience. One is, I would say, probably more mid-range. He had done several trials as a clinical site PI, but had really never led a clinical trial, and one is really experienced. So there's kind of a diversity of that, and I think the network, at least obviously provides, seems to be working pretty well for all of them at this point. But, if we can take questions on the panel now, I don't know how you want to do that. But that's
Thank you. I think we'll just have each of the networks go, and then we'll just have a sort of group discussion. All right, next, Dr. Robert Silbergleit and Valerie Durkalski from the Neurologic Emergencies Treatment Trials Network.
So I think there's 30 minutes for that talk, us, and a panel discussion, right?
Correct.
And I think we're about 15, 20 minutes.
We started a little late.
Okay.
Everybody still has to fill out their evaluations. This discussion needs to go a little longer. Can go a little longer.
Okay. Well, our intention was to keep it more formal anyway. I don't have slides. We agreed together that we're going to do it that way, but we've got to ask for this. So, so I think the history of network development within NINDS was the NETT came first, and then NeuroNEXT, and then StrokeNET, and so you can sort of see a progression on a lot of the features that Chris talked about, and a lot of the same notions for why the networks exist are the same. So I think that presentation was really good because it actually echoes most of the things that have to do with NETT and StrokeNET too, in terms of why they exist and a lot of the elements of basic structure. So some of the things have been an evolution. NETT doesn't have a central IRB that was developed in NeuroNEXT and is continued on into StrokeNET, and the turfs are obviously a little different. So let's talk a little bit about that. So NETT, the history behind it was that when the NINDS-TPA stroke study was done, there was a lot of doubt that people could do that study. And that study was actually constructed not with a grant application, but with a contract mechanism. So that John Marler, who was head of clinical trials at that time, Yoda, as we know, had this idea that if he could construct the study teams that did not exist organically, he could make this happen, and they would need to break down some of the silos that had inherently existed that prevented certain research from being done. So, for example, neurology clinical trials started when the patient got up to the neurology floor of the neuro ICU, because that's when the neurologist saw the patient. So what's the earliest you could access the patient was several hours after they arrived at the medical facility. But there was a meeting where Bill Barson and John Marler had stepped out of the meeting, and John sort of said, what do you think the earliest you can treat somebody with acute stroke is? And Bill said, I don't know, I suppose probably within 90 minutes or 180 minutes. And John said, great. And that sort of is how the time windows for the NINDS-TPA study came up, sort of like the old story about Fisher and what would be clinically significant. So the NINDS-TPA trial, through a contract, mandated that emergency physicians and neurologists and other professionals work together, create an infrastructure that could do trials in the emergency environment, which was thought to be impossible before, and it worked great. And NINDS had one of its landmark positive major clinical trials, and then much to John's chagrin, the trial went away, the contracts went away, and the whole thing fell apart, and then people spent years trying to figure out how to regain that kind of ability to do stroke trials, multi-center, places. There were certain places that had positive experiences that continued to be that way, but it was hard to create that anew. And so there was a motion, a lot of politics within the Institute to try to figure out how to do this, and ultimately a workshop was followed by an RFA to create the NET, and that's how it happened. The territory for the NET is hyperacute treatments in any kind of neurologic emergency, things that start in the ambulance or the emergency department and continue on into, usually into the ICU, but anywhere in that turf. The domain was restricted to, at least initially, to phase 3 confirmatory trials. So the idea was things that would really change clinical practice. Over the years, that's been loosened a little bit to the extent that we now sort of have a green light to do phase 2 trials that are late phase 2 or that are clearly part of the development process that's leading quickly into phase 3, so that we don't have that awkward political structure going somewhere for a phase 2 and then having to change your data management center and change your clinical coordinating center in order to do your phase 3 with entirely different people. But it's not an incubator. It's not a early phase 2. Let's try lots of different things out environment. And there's a lot more to say about it. Given the limited amount of time, why don't you comment about some things and anything more you want to say about that, and then go to StrokeNET.
Yeah.
And then I think we should bring Chris back up and really answer questions to get at whatever out of that.
Yeah, that sounds good. We were fortunate enough, my unit at the Medical University of South Carolina, we're called the Data Coordination Unit, or the DCU for short, and we successfully competed to be the Statistical Data Management Center for the NET, and then also for the StrokeNET, so we're part of both networks. So the little slight differences with the StrokeNET is, so we're going into our second year of that grant, and the way the proposals come in is very similar to NeuroNEXT, and of course this is only for stroke trials. But when the project comes in to us, what happens is we have working groups. So we have a rehab working group, an acute working group, and then prevention. Thank you. And so those protocols will go for review of feasibility to those groups, and then it'll be determined, but the same grant submission process. Slight difference between the networks is, I believe, for NeuroNEXT and StrokeNET, is that one grant goes in. So if you're the PI, your grant will go in and it'll be sub-awards. For NET, it's slightly different. So what we have is multiple grants, companion applications. So usually the Statistical Data Management Center will have their own UO1, and it'll be a companion application with a clinical application. So that would probably be the major differences with it. As the Statistical Data Management Center, we welcome working with other biostatisticians. There's no way, our group is large, but we're not that large to be able to supply all the statistical collaboration. So a lot of times we will, if an investigator comes with their person they've been working with forever, that's great. We're more than happy to collaborate with them. Usually we'll ask them what they want their role to be. Some people want to serve as the blinded statistician, and then we'll be the unblinded statisticians and do all the reporting and interim analysis and things. But we're happy to formulate it whatever works best for folks. So sometimes we get the misconception that we're now the statisticians and you got to leave your groups behind, but that's not it at all. We're more than welcome to work with folks. Maybe we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, so unless people want
More
details about
information?
anything, I mean, I guess I should meet your own corner up to say, so that was established 8 years ago. We completed 3 large, so we completed the Alias trial, the Rampart trial, and the Protect trial. We're currently,
No, that was the one.
I missed it. They did not.
We did.
But that didn't do it. And currently are enrolling in ongoing the Point trial, the ATAC trial, and Shine. Shine being the most important of them all, of course.
She might last And
then we're starting up ESET, which is just starting up. And then we've got other pipeline. We've always got lots of things in the pipeline, so lots of other applications that are pending.
Right, that's right?
I guess I just have a general, maybe it's for all three groups, but is the process you apply to various trial groups, and then you also apply to something like CNR or neuro where they're independently evaluated, or is it going to one and then how's the?
So I'll tell you for our experience, then let them tell us different. So for NET, we're talking about phase 3 trials for the most part. So usually it all starts with a discussion with the program officer. And the program officer will sort of usually rapidly identify things that would even be conceivably appropriate for one of the networks and would direct you to the network to begin your conversation. So you know, if something came in unsolicited that hadn't been talked to a program, so normally you have to talk to the program officer first, because normally for one of these clinical trials you're over 500,000, so you have to get permission to submit the grant application, and then you get directed. If something came in under 500,000 and nobody had bothered to talk to the program officer, already probably a problem. But if that had happened, the program officers would usually see when it came in that they got that they were directed, and it might go through review, or it might get sort of pulled from review and pulled to go through there. But that's how it usually happens. But then otherwise, though, however it gets directed to us, what we usually do is start with a meeting, just sit down, and the level of review that takes place at the network is really a level of review to say, is this appropriate for the network? So it's not the purpose of the network to be another level of peer review and say, is this good enough? It's not a question of whether it's good enough or not. That's for peer review. There's plenty of peer review. We don't want to add to peer review. But it'll be an assessment for is this appropriate for the network, and how can it be appropriate? What needs to change to make it a better fit, and what can we add in terms of content or design in order to make it better? It works best when they have a relatively early idea before they've developed very much, to come to us and start working on it all together, so that we don't unravel things that are different. But we've had all sorts of stages. NET has picked up trials that were actually already started and were failing, and picked it up to fix the broken administrative aspects of it. And then things have come to us pretty well formed, and we've just worked to smooth over some edges. And then, but my personal feeling is that the most successful trials are the ones that we either develop within the group or at a very early stage that says, I have an idea, and we can work with them from the ground up, and that's where we do the best. But all of those are options.
Failing in terms of enrollment.
Failing in terms of enrollment. Because we don't know whether.
Exactly.
So then I'm understanding that when the idea is brought to you, start developing this idea, then it still goes out for external scientific.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. So one of the things that was different, all three of the networks share the new paradigm. So before this, most of the institute's networks all work the same way. It was that the network was awarded, and it was awarded a pot of money to do clinical trials, and then the network would have some kind of internal process for deciding what they wanted to do, and then there'd usually be some form of peer review group that was sort of internal to the group, but mostly the networks were given a pot of money to do trials, and they could do as much trials as they could do for that pot of money, and that's how the Parkinson's network and stuff had been set up before. That's how the cancer networks had been set up before. And these three networks all broke that mold and said, you've got money for infrastructure, you do not get awarded enough money to do the trials. And then they asked for the trials to come in as individual applications, get peer reviewed with the whole rest of the world of stuff, and it makes it much harder administratively to run the network and manage your pipeline, because you never know what's going to come in when, and you worry that you're going to get too low and you're going to have idling costs, or you worry that you're going to have too many good ideas run at the same time and you're not going to have the bandwidth to do it all. So it's much harder to administrate, but it ensures the best science. It makes sure that the resources that are invested in the networks are available to anybody, not just to the lucky few who were incorporated in the network at the beginning. And so the value in terms of better science, open access, outweighs the pains in my neck that I have to live with as a result from it.
It's also, I mean, at least this is where NeuroNEXT is probably a little different from the others because we have such a wide disease focus that the network is not really set up to help you design the trial in the sense of help you put everything together. The network is really set up to help you kind of finalize the key aspects of the design, right? Because there's so many potential things that could come through in a lot of different.
I think not just the diseases, but also the level. There's many more phase 2 trial ideas than there are phase 3 trial ideas. So, you know, you're stuck with a much broader.
Yeah, and so the thought is a lot of that's done before, which is, in some ways, I think, in Marianne and Dixie here, they run a lot of the calls with investigators. It's one of the challenges of the network, because one of the goals of the network is to help junior investigators establish themselves as clinical researchers. And junior investigators often need the most help designing studies. But the network does not have the resources to help every single person who comes in with an idea. So it's something that we really struggle with, I think, as a network. And I don't know that there's an optimal way to solve that we've really come up with, but it's a challenge. And someone who has the resources to pull a good idea together, maybe just needs help polishing it, are almost at an advantage coming into a network like that, which is kind of counter because you'd like to help someone. I mean, one of the goals of having an infrastructure in place is someone who's at maybe an institution with a great idea that doesn't have a CTSA, doesn't have a lot of infrastructure to do that. It would be almost impossible for them to pull it together locally. If that idea could come into a network, it makes that study feasible. But still, at the same time, somebody's got to help pull that idea together into something that's going to pass peer review, right? Because if it's a great idea, and maybe it's the best trial that could ever been done, but the grant's poorly written or not clear, it's not going to get through peer review. So that's one of the struggles in terms of trying to make this work. I mean, one of the challenges also with NeuroNEXT is, and this is why it's really important that we don't do any scientific review, is I think one of the concerns has always been, because you cover such a broad disease, right? And if you had like an internal committee vetting what's worthwhile to go forward and to invest network resources in, you run into issues like, okay, it's that, the investigators, even at these 25 sites, have different areas in neurology that they're interested in. So does something in somebody's area, is it seen as more attractive? Maybe not necessarily that it's the most scientifically best, but because they know more about it and see the end result of where it would go versus something maybe in a rare disease that no one in the network really is working actively in, doesn't get the same scrutiny. So there's a lot of challenges like that you're trying to balance.
And I think StrokeNET is similar to NeuroNEXT in that way, that usually the proposals that come in are a little more developed once we get to that review by the working groups.
So this is a question directed at NeuroNEXT. NeuroNEXT would seem like a slam dunk, by far the most logical place for me to work with for my medium-sized phase 2 clinical trial. But I've been literally repeatedly discouraged from submitting to NeuroNEXT, hearing from various places that it's very, very hard to get accepted. They take very few studies. And yesterday from Robin directly that you guys are really backlogged. There are a number of studies that are trying to get up and launched, and so right now is not a good time. So I would love to hear more thoughts from anyone involved in the NeuroNEXT architecture right now.
Yeah, so there are a lot of facets to that. So I'll address first. So there's 4 ongoing studies in NeuroNEXT, and really, when we looked at capacity, right, it was set up to do 5 to 7 studies over the 7-year period. So we still have bandwidth to bring on additional trials. There are a lot of things percolating through the pipeline. I don't necessarily know that it's hard to get accepted into the network, right, for consideration. I think there are a lot of misconceptions with NeuroNEXT on a lot of different areas. So with a good proposal, a lot of things get turned down by the network as not feasible. I think when we've looked, it's about, a third of them get rejected as not feasible. Some of those are because maybe it needs a specialized piece of equipment that the sites don't have, or there's something nuanced about it. But I would say probably half to 2/3 of the ones that are rejected as not feasible. It's just because the idea is not well thought out, right? And the feedback goes back, in other words, the idea is not clear. Maybe the sample size has really nothing to do with what is the primary objective, so there's no way to really assess feasibility. And so this kind of goes back really for the reason that we talked about with the question before. The network doesn't have the resources to help everyone pull the basics of their idea together. So if someone doesn't have, you know, at least the raw structure of it in place, it's going to be not feasible for the network at that point. In terms of like success rate, there's a lot of, when we're at meetings where we hear things, well, NeuroNEXT doesn't have a good success rate. Well, you know, in terms of funding for grants for first submission, that's absolutely correct. But remember, these ideas come in. We're not allowed to do any scientific review, right? If it's feasible, then we're providing this help to flesh it out. That means, right, so if the network sees a proposal and it's feasible, there are subjects in there, then we're going to provide help to the investigators. I mean, there have been numerous things that have come through where those of us who are like the PCC leads and the CCC leads who have sat on study section know, right, the rationale is not strong for this, or this is not really written really well, you know, you may help some, but I mean, after you've been on study section, you can predict there's certain keywords and triggers in grant applications that you know are just going to rile reviewers. So we still have to work on them. We can't say, no, I don't think it's going to get funded, you can't. So our success rate on first submissions is actually 0%, right? Which is actually not that inconsistent with clinical trial grants as a whole. The thing that, well, nothing gets funded the first time on a clinical trial. Well, I shouldn't say nothing. It's very hard to get a clinical trial funded the first time. What we have found in NeuroNEXT, though, is almost that first review. It kind of does what peer review is intended to do. It's the first scientific, rigorous review. And so if that, you know, triages the application, or it gets a 70 or an 80, you know, then it kind of goes away. Maybe it's not something that, you know, wasn't scientifically high enough on that priority for study section. But if something comes to us with a score like in the high 30s or in the mid 40s, where, you know, you look at the summary statement, there's fixable things. What we've done as a network is then we provide a little bit more help to those applications because they're closer. They're, you know, I think have a high, you know, those are the ones that have a high chance of getting funded. If you're responsive to the summary statement, you know, maybe there was good scientific rationale, the study section bought that, but there were some methodological concerns, or maybe they didn't feel like the preclinical evidence was totally there, it needs to be described better, or something was missing from the application. You can address those. And I think we've had 8, is that right? 8 before this cycle. And if I'm remembering right, then it's either 4, I think of those 8, 3 were funded. 4 were funded. Yeah, those 8 resubmissions, 4 were funded, and 1 got a fundable score, but was put on hold for various reasons. So, you know, on that side, the things that passed this initial scientific review, I think the network has had a really, I mean, 5 out of 8, even if you take the one that's not funded that had a fundable score and was put on hold by NINDS, that's a pretty good track record. And I think that's an advantage, particularly with the one, as I mentioned in my talk, 2 of the ones that are funded are investigators who have never done a clinical trial before. When I say never, not even as a side investigator, right? There is absolutely no way that without the help of a network and the infrastructure resources, again, I guess I shouldn't say no way, right? It's statistician is always but it's extremely unlikely that someone who has never done a clinical trial as a site PI could write an application for, you know, a phase 2 clinical trial that requires 15 sites and get it funded through study section. You know, the chances of that happening are probably similar to the chances of me sitting quietly during karaoke. So I think the network...
I said nothing 0, so it's helping out with things that is right.
If you said this, I apologize. Just to clarify for people, just because it's a network doesn't mean you have to put every study in it. So are there limits for each network on the number of sites you ought to have to try to engage the network?
Yeah, and that's a good point. So for NeuroNEXT, there is a threshold that your study needs to use at least 4 sites in order to use the network. I don't know what it is for the network.
I'm going to say for StrokeNET, there's not, is it 5? Thank you, Brent. I just said that. 5, but we do a feasibility survey to see how many sites would be necessary for your study.
For NETT, the expectation is that every hub will participate in every trial. And, you know, again, these are generally large confirmatory studies. There's nothing that we've done where we did not feel like we needed more than we had as the optimal number. But there is scalability in terms of the fact that it's a hub and spoke network, so each of the academic hubs has multiple enrollment hospitals, and depending on the trial, they may enroll at multiple enrollment hospitals within their hub-spoke complex, or just one, depending on the complexity of the patient population and where those patients show up. So there is there is scalability. The number of enrolling sites enrolling net sites at point is twice as many as the number of enrolling net sites in China.
One of the things that's relevant to that too, at least with NeuroNEXT, is if you're a PI of a study coming to NeuroNEXT at an institution that's not a NeuroNEXT institution, your institution can also participate. You have to use 4 network sites. So if you're from a non, you'd have to have really 5 sites if you wanted to enroll such as at your site. The other piece of that, though, that is very relevant, this is where you have to talk to your institutional, staff to make sure there's buy-in. So your site would contract just for that study, but your IRB would have to see to the central IRB for that study. So right, investigators who come into the network have to kind of start that dialogue ahead of time, because at least with NeuroNEXT, IRBs, it's more accepted now than it was when we started NeuroNEXT, although there's still, I think, some initial resistance to IRBs, but if it's contingent upon getting the grant dollars, usually they come around, but that's part of it. Wendy, did you have any comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one thing. I mean, I think there's immense advantages to working with the networks, but I just wanted to make sure people are aware that there are 2 clinical trial funding announcements from NINDS. One's for exploratory trials and one's for phase 3 trials. So if you don't, fit into one of the networks, or if your topic area isn't something that at the time they accept, there are other funding ways that you can look into for trials.
And the slide that we put up yesterday for Jeopardy included those, and that's going to be a base camp. Thank you, Mike.
So I don't really understand the timeline. So we're hearing that you should involve the network early so that you don't have to unravel and change things a lot, and there's help in design. But then we're also hearing it has to go through peer review first, which I would assume it would need to be pretty well developed. So can you kind of just, in a very simplistic form, walk through when we should first contact the network, when we should first discuss things with the network, when we should submit, like how, involve early but have it, formed well enough to go through peer review is a bit contradictory.
Well, the first contact should usually always be with NINDS, right? And for any of the networks usually. So you would talk to, program officer there and say, I've got this idea, this is what I'm putting together. And they can, as Wendy mentioned, there are other options. They may say, okay, I think NeuroNEXT or StrokeNET or NETT is something you should consider, and NINDS basically has to kind of accept it and route it through the networks first. So that's where the initial discussion should start. If that comes in, then you would start the discussion with the network in terms of planning for your grant application.
For StrokeNET, we suggest at that point at least 6 months before the grant's due. At least.
Yeah. And that's a common, right, that's a common, I think, misconception. Somebody comes in with something and they want to submit it the next month, and usually that's just not feasible. There's a lot of things that have to be worked out to write the grant, to flesh out the budget that takes time. It's all the operational things.
And I think there is, part of the message is different because the network's different. So I think we all struggle with that same bandwidth problem of what can we take on and what can we help, and how do we choose who to help most right now because of how far along they are, where they are, and we don't necessarily have the time to talk. But we all suffer from the problem of not being able to help everybody as much as we would like who comes and talks to us. But that being said, I think the bigger problem for NeuroNEXT than it is for NETT, and the number of people who can plausibly get a confirmatory phase 3 trial application through is much smaller than the number of people who can plausibly do a good phase 2 trial. So we're all stressed. We all have similar stress, but we're probably not quite as stressed as they are in that respect. And it's probably more important than when the phase 3 application goes in, it really does need more of our input than some of the phase 2 applications.
And something that I knew before NeuroNEXT that have a totally, I think, different appreciate now having done it. Phase 3 studies are very difficult to do, right? They're hard to design. But I think having gone through all these other phase 2 studies it's only a lot harder to design than phase 3, right? Because if you get to phase 3, you've got the earlier phase 1, phase 2 evidence. You have a pretty clear sense of what your primary objective should be. Phase 2 is kind of all over the board, right? You're not really powering it for efficacy because that would be your phase 3 study. You can't just do an underpowered phase 2 trial. You have to figure out what's the reasonable question in here that will give me the information I need to know whether I need to go forward to a phase 3. That's one of the big components in the NeuroNEXT RFA is these are phase 2 trials that kind of have a go, no-go decision, right? And that if this is positive, it would suggest this is worthwhile to go to a phase 3. How do you put something together that's feasible given the constraints of what you can do, but still answers a question adequately? It's not like, no matter what you do, it's going to pass you forward to a phase 3 trial, whether your intervention or drug works or not. And so I think I knew that before. Now we all have a whole new appreciation.
And even I'd agree with that, although I put the caveat on that it depends on how well the phase 2 was done.
That's true.
Okay. So it's really true when the phase 2 was done really, really well. When the phase 2 is not done really well, it actually becomes much harder to do the phase 3.
I had a question. I'm wondering what the experience is across the 3 networks as far as those proposals that are deemed feasible to come into the network and really start hashing things out with the PIs. You know, some of them proceed faster than others. For those that really drag out, do you have a sense for like the commonalities across those particular proposals that makes them take that extra time and extra resources really within the network?
So we were just asked, so Chris just asked me if we have like a triage rule. It's enough. Currently we don't, but I think the common theme is the team or the clinical PI or whoever who approached us, it drags out because the communication's not there, right? We'll hear from them and then maybe 3 months later we won't hear from them. And when they start to drag out, then...
If you ever say like you can share in the video, please go away.
We haven't done that yet.
In NeuroNEXT, we do have a 6-month policy in place, so if there's been no interaction or correspondence with someone who's got one percolating through in 6 months, then it doesn't necessarily kick it out of the network. What that does is it says your original network feasibility is revoked, right? If you want to come back in, it would have to be reconsidered by the executive committee again. Because a lot of things can change, right? In a disease area. Maybe there are other trials that it was feasible 6 months to a year ago and it's no longer feasible. And I think also, just to be blunt, if someone is not really being that communicated and pulling together a clinical trial application, they're probably not going to be the best person to work for as PI in a clinical trial.
I actually don't think there's commonalities. I think it's sort of interesting that everyone comes and it's a totally different story every time. And if there's something that doesn't work, it doesn't work for a completely different reason than we've experienced before. So I mean, you've got the person who comes in and we have a discussion. We say, here's 5 big problems with this that we need to try to figure out a solution to. And some of them say, great, and they dedicate themselves to it, and they want to meet every week to work through these 5 problems, and they work through them. The next person comes in and say there's big 5 problems, and they come back and they say, great, and they come back 2 weeks later with exactly the same thing that they had in the first place. And you say, this doesn't solve any of the problems. They say, yeah, but I didn't decide they weren't problems. So you say, well, the problems, let's go back and think about them. They come back again with the same thing. And you work through it, no matter where you go, it always comes back to the same place, and it takes forever. And then there's people like you said, you say, here are 5 big problems, and say, oh, I'll work on that, and then you never hear from them again. It's just all sorts of different personalities, and I'm having a real hard time finding the commonality.
I was going to say, could you just mention what the purpose of this new network, the Siren Network, or what it's supposed to do with all these other networks?
So, yeah, I can catch that. So, can I answer? No. Can I address it? Yes. So the reason is because there's actually very little detail out yet. It's all being negotiated, and it's being negotiated by people that I don't know and talk to. So for people who don't know it, so NETT is having its 10th, will be coming up next year on its 10th year, and so there's a 10-year renewal. 10-year renewals require the whole network to be recompeted anyway. So you can't just keep giving money to the same people without having open competition. And so we had our 10-year, NETT had its 10-year evaluation, which went swimmingly actually. And at the same council where they presented the the 10-year evaluation, where we got really marvelous reviews, they announced that there's going to be an evolution in the network when it gets recompeted, and they want to share this success with some other partners. And so the renewal of NETT is currently projected. There's an information notice that says this. This is the only way I can say this. And the NHLBI and DoD have agreed to partner to, in the renewal of this network, have a broader scope that includes not just neurologic emergencies, but cardiac and traumatic emergencies as well. And that's happening around the same time that the ROC, which is the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium, which was NHLBI's emergency network, is being defunded. So that's what I know. Certainly the notion, as I have been made to understand it, is not that NETT is going away or being replaced. The idea is for them to evolve it into a broader mission. There's anxieties about whether there will be, whether it's a Peter Principle thing. We're doing so well that they're going to keep, expanding it until it fails. So there's some anxieties with this, but there's also a lot of great opportunities, I hope, with it, and it's certainly meant to be a progression, not a termination. So the rumors of NETT's demise, I think, are premature. But Siren will be competed. It's the notice says that the RFAs are going to be out at the end of 2015. But there's anytime that there's negotiations between three entities, such as NINDS, NHLBI, and DoD, my thought is that I would not be surprised if there are delays in the success of those negotiations. I mean, how long did it take for us to get this deal from Vienna? I mean, so and it's sort of similar, right? Iran and the U.S. and NHLBI and NINDS. It's a lot of trust issues.
So one other question that maybe we can close with this. I mean, certainly, again, I'm not too worried about cutting into your evaluation time, but the evaluations, while anonymous, are not optional. What are the so thinking about this? I mean, some of these things are going to be appropriate. Some of the projects that are being developed here may be appropriate for networks. Maybe it's a rare disease. Maybe you're never going to get enough patients here on site. But in general, both as members of clinical trial study sections and also representatives of these networks, what are the characteristics of early learn phase trials that they may be designing that are associated with successful progression along the translational pathway? What are the sorts of things that you've seen as the justification? What are the sorts of trials they can do that motivate a study section or clinical trial network to say, aha, this is a good idea, we should go further with it?
So I think one of the things that is a difference in the way that industry thinks in terms of doing their trials and the way academic trials traditionally work. Because academic trials are often thought of in a vacuum. If you're writing a grant to do this trial, and you're focused so much on the specifics of that trial. I think from sitting on study section and also the things that come through the network, the things I think that are strongest is when you almost take in, not exactly an industry view, but almost like an industry view where you're looking at it like a program, particularly if it's an early phase trial, is thinking of, okay, where is this going? Why is it important? Because a lot of times on study section, you might see a really wonderful trial come through. It's well designed. It's got nice scientific rationale, but if it's positive, then the question is, okay, then what, right? It's not clear what are the next steps, and so maybe it's just not that attractive, from a funding perspective, because there's nowhere to see where that trial's going to go. Particularly for early phase trials, I think that's important. So I think thinking where it's going, seeing how it fits into the big picture, which also then, if you're dealing with early phase, will help you think of, right, your go, no-go, right? What criteria would you need to meet in order to take the next step, with some idea of what that next step is? What would you, what criteria might prevent you from doing that, or maybe rethink the process and going through, which is a different way, I think, than academic trialists typically think, because we're thinking, I got to get my grants, I got to get funding to keep my team supported, and so forth. So that would be my answer.
I guess to add to that is when you're writing these early phase studies, just remember also during the grant review process, don't skimp on your statistics or your data management. You still need to think about that, and that's an important part of your grant. And don't be scared of the budget. First, think about what you really need to do your study. Even if you calculate your sample size and it ends up being 200, 300, go back to the question you're asking and make sure that that's the right question. And then let it guide you. Don't let your budget guide your study, right? And don't forget those key other pieces, because even in the early phase, like we said, phase 2 sometimes is even harder than phase 3, and you still need your solid statistics, and you need a plan for data management.
And the statistics piece, right? There's a couple of don't do's, right? So do not, you need the statistics in your grant, but do not just ask your statistician to write some text that you just plop in there randomly. That stands out like a sore thumb. It's easy to tell, and you're like, okay, this is not really an integrated team, right? The other side of that is, it goes back to kind of what Brett was saying earlier in terms of building teams, right? If the statistician on your grant you can show that you've interacted with before, you have an ongoing collaboration, that's kind of important in evaluating a clinical trial. If you plug a statistician because you found a name of someone at your institution who's doing statistics, but you've never talked with them before, you have no history of collaboration, study sections are going to be a little skeptical that there's actually a collaboration there that's going to allow you to do the clinical trial. Because if you take the data at the end of the study to the statistician to analyze, that's probably not the ideal way to do a clinical trial. And those are the kinds of errors that come up. And with study section on these clinical trial grants, it's almost like a leak in a dam. Once the water starts seeping through, once there's a weakness that's seen, then everything just starts to fall through, right? So you want to keep it as tight as possible and not get any area where you can kind of start, people start picking it apart.
Yeah, so I mean, I think those would have been my number 1 and 2 sort of answers as well. I think the biggest thing that I see is, especially in that phase, is lacking scientific objectivity. The number of applications that come in whose purpose is to prove what I already know so that other people will let me do the phase 3 trial that I also know is going to work, because I know that my idea works, right? The whole point of science is to prove it to someone else. And that's very clear in the writing most of the time. And a lot of the phase 2 trials that have been successful in terms of being funded have not been successful scientifically, which is why we have so many failed therapeutic progressions, right? Most research fails, right? And that's okay. I mean, things should fail in order to learn things, but I'm not sure they should fail 95% of the time, which is sort of where we end up being. And it's I think because we don't, people don't sit back and say, I'm designing the study because of all the things that I don't know about this therapy that's very exciting, and I need to learn these things. And you need to have, at the end of a good phase 2, there will be a no-go decision. The exploratory opportunity for an NINDS, I think, is really well written in that it says, that at the end of the day, the grant application has to say, I'm going to go with it. These criteria are met. I'm not going to go with these criteria aren't met. But the number that come in with that specified, where the chance of not going is sort of predetermined to be extraordinarily low. I'm going to go if my therapy doesn't kill everybody. It's high. I mean, there's a lot of, I think it was actually you that you talked about how futile some of the futility analyses that came across the study section were. They were futile futility analyses. There was no way they were ever going to identify, futility. So I think that to the degree that you can step back, ask yourself a question, make sure that your study can go either way and will be informed it either way. If it can fail informatively, that's going to be far more useful than an application that just is a stepping stone to the next step.
And one other thing that exploratory trials mechanism says, and specifically bans, is using phase 2 as a way to estimate effect size, which is, as you've learned here, that's a different way of phrasing an underpowered phase 3 trial for all intents and purposes. So that is actually written in, as Robert said, that's a really well-written thing to think about. But some institutes, or a few years ago, you could say, well, when I said, if you look at a trial and that's what somebody else did, it's like thinking that maybe that's a good thing to do. That's clearly something that's been recognized as not a good thing to do. So a lot of this is, we talk about phase 2 and exploratory phase being hard. One of the reasons it's hard is you have to come up with what's the good scientifically interesting question that motivates you towards that go, no-go decision.